Okay, there's the message that says we're recording it too. Okay, so I wanted to take the time and acknowledge that I am located in the heart of downtown Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples as well. The British Crown stole approximately 3 million acres of land from the Mississaugas of Credit between Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, and Lake Erie through between the Lakes Purchase Number 3 Treaty. That's in 1792, and not a lot has happened since then to right these egregious wrongs. We continue to live and take from the land that had been stewarded by our Indigenous friends for thousands of years. So there's no easy transition or segue away from that fact, nor should there be. But for folks who are new to this, this is a gathering where we make a space for you to be as authentically you as possible. And again, we are never going to police what you say, right? You have the license to share what's on your heart, and you can share it in the way that you see fit. The only time we start stick handling any of that is when, you know, someone decides that they want to be like a jerk about things and make the space unwelcome to that freedom of expression. I don't think that's ever happened yet. So maybe don't break that record, guys. Cool. Okay, cool. So in case you didn't know, we do have these larger COPs every 3 months. And in between, we have more intimate COPs, community of practices that are a bit more of a closer look at any sort of given topic. Last month, we had a focus on using, poetry to be present with our grief. Or also, we had some fantastic speakers that actually epitomized the directive of nothing about us without us. That was last month's. The previous month to that was the poetry one, which is banging. So the monthly COPs are hosted by Carly Babb, our national coordinator for these COPs, who's right there. I'm pointing right here, but on my screen, they're there. And, from one friend to another, you should absolutely go to them. They are mind-blowing. Not like this one ain't going to be, but like seriously, really go to these things too. So anyway, today, I think this one might be the first time in all of these that we aren't actually changing the format at all. We're actually gonna stick with the format that we used last time, where our speakers will give a bit of an intro of themselves, and then we'll dive right into them chatting about their experience and their topic today. We're gonna have a bit of a bio break, and then after that bit, we're gonna come back and we're gonna open the mic up for everyone to ask questions and whatnot as well. Like all of our gatherings, we will, of course, be running our thought exchange tool to gather your thoughts and exchange them so that we can make any changes or, tweaks or anything to make your experience with us today more valuable to you, and, maybe make you feel, more welcome or whatever you're looking to get out of these things. So let us know your thoughts on what we talked about today or any number of things. And then, one of the biggest trends that we've seen from these data captures over all of our COPs is that, us as a community wanted more information on Indigenous communities and what's happening, in their neck of the woods. So we're doing that, right? See how easy it is to have your needs met, right? All of you people pleasers out there who are worried that your needs will be too much of a burden on the people who care about you, that they'll not love you anymore and then abandon you because you're a human and need things. Well, guess what, pal? You're loved here. You're seen, you're heard, and we deliver. Feel it, bask in it. Okay. So lastly, I'm literally calling out people who experience childhood trauma and use anxious attachment styles way to deal with it. Sorry, folks. So lastly, in the light of feeling, a sense of belonging, at the end of these COPs, the SJA team will tend to stick around. I'll stick around, and we can certainly, chat about whatever you've got on your mind, and you let your thoughts find purchase in the ears of those that will stay and listen. So do hang around if you want to share your thoughts after that too. But without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to our guests today. We have Denise Lambert from Kimamow Atoskawnow Foundation. KAF is the only rural land-based Aboriginal HIV/AIDS service organization in Canada. They provide mobile information and support services across Alberta and other provinces as well, Treaty 8, 6, and 7, of course. Our friends at CAF notes that their culturally principled approach to their work includes what mainstream programming calls harm reduction. Denise is Cree from Treaty 6 territory. Also PhD candidate at the University of Alberta, so bit of a flex there, pal. And Denise has experience working for Indigenous peoples from local to global levels, and even bigger. The other arm comes out. So thank you, Denise, for joining us today. We also have Emma from the Native Youth Sexual Health Network joining us today. The NYSHN is an organization by and for Indigenous youth that work across issues of sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice throughout the US and Canada. Emma is a Anishinaabe, Obijay, and Chippewa youth who is a Turtle Clan and Two-Spirit from Charlotte Lake, Ontario. They have been running wildly through NYSHN projects since 2009. Does anybody say 2009? 2009. All right. 2009. No. When you were 8 years old in 2009? I should have read that first. I'm just going to tell you that right now. And their mother brought them along to the Grandmother Spirit Project meetings at the age of 8. Now, as an older, younger person, they direct that passion towards empowering Indigenous youth and communities across Turtle Island to engage in the work that they know to bring back the healing, strength, and inherent sexy resilience of their communities and families. That hurt a lot on the inside. So welcome all of our speakers. Denise, why don't you start us off and teach us about what you and CAF do while I go reconcile some feelings.
While you go look for some bee pollen.
Yeah.
Oh my. Well, I'd just like to say I'm very appreciative of this opportunity, and I put quite a lot of thought into what can I share in a small amount of time that may be of use to people that are working in this field. And so I started out with some really broad ideas, and then I thought, well, is it Indigenous harm reduction or not? So that kind of gives you a lead into the presentation. So you want me just to go right ahead and begin? Okay. So I know that the next slide, and it's a beautiful slide set, and I want to acknowledge my daughter Sierra for finding this, and I know that she's online as well, some other family members. We, as part of Kimamow Atoskawnow Foundation, some of our very core principles and values around the work that we do, it's centered around life and family, and recognizing the strengths and challenges that we bring as family networks. I want to say that for Kimamow, this is our 30th year anniversary, and it was formally, the organization started in like early, I want to say late 80s, early 90s, but formally incorporated in 1992, which was a significant year for Indigenous peoples as well. And our foundation or beginnings were around the HIV and AIDS circumstance at that time. I do want to acknowledge that I am in Treaty 6, live, work, play, love Treaty 6 territory. I have Cree and Stoney connection as well. I also have French and English background, and I'll speak a little more around identity and the complexities of that further on. And of course, with CAF, we have a unique governance structure. So many of our board members, as some may call them, are actually long-term knowledge keepers, elders, persons with experience in many fields. So the next slide. I don't know if there's a signal, Carly, I should give you. And I should acknowledge as well St. John's Ambulance and just this opportunity. So I put this, recognizing that this is a safe space and that we can say whatever we want. One of the ways that many of our facilitators and presenters and will often hear this, I'll apologize in advance if I say or do anything that may offend anybody that's listening. And we sometimes laugh about this, but it's true. If there are things that might be new or uncomfortable or challenge the way that we consider things, no offense intended. It's just, again, I'm sharing a point of view and some experience. So hopefully it's not going to get that way. Next slide. So just, following the academic presentation facilitation approach to providing an overview, what am I going to talk about? So I'm going to share a viewpoint that's called the tree of creation. So this is a nature-based model that we use in much of our work. Discussion, and again, this comes from asking the question, well, what do people really want to hear me speak about on this virtual this virtual opportunity? So colonial policy, drug poisoning, healing, critiques and concepts, and then I'll explain a little bit about those other concepts as we go further. So that's just a quick view. The next slide. So this is the fabulous tree of creation. And this is the way that I and many others do our work at a personal level, interpersonal, professional, organizational. It has its own set of teachings that go along with it. This model was created in May of 1996, and it started as I was working trying to find ways for, at that time we were known as Aboriginal peoples. So in the temporal shifting of identity, we were Aboriginal then, and this was for an Aboriginal HIV and AIDS strategy. And I was asked to come up with, through the voices of people in diverse communities, what do we need to address some of the issues facing us? And so again, this itself could take it could take a long time depending on how far you want to go, but it brings in the past, the present, and the future. I usually ask people just to take a moment and look at this and what actually, what are you drawn to? What grabs your attention, or what do you understand from the symbolism or the images portrayed? And it's interesting that this, started out as, oh, it's just a great picture. We're going to have, either you have healthy roots or unhealthy roots, but it's now moved into a much more complex approach. So we use this is our logic model when we do project planning. It brings in evaluation. There's a number of different things. And I'm actually, just to go back to the flexing the arm, I'm actually gathering the stories around how this was created and how it's used. And that is going to be, sorry, and I apologize for the academic language, but the theoretical and methodological framework, this is what I'm going to be sharing. And that is not created by me. The true creation brings in how we all must work together, and we all have different approaches, but we're looking for some future. So that's just the perspective I bring is this to this conversation. Next slide, please. So when we talked or had the notes around what to touch on in this conversation, and one of the issues was, the policies that impact Indigenous peoples. And so again, in some of the writing that I've had to review, there is a lot that is said about colonization, discrimination, etc. But there's also a very strong sense that Indigenous peoples have this need to be controlled, tamed, or saved. And so I just call attention to that, particularly in the harm reduction discourse and practice, that the saviorism is a long-standing approach that has been imposed on our people. and to recognize what that means in this current contemporary time is important. Next slide, please. You might notice I keep going, and I should have noted at the beginning that I carry my medicine with me. And that's one of those great things you can hang on to. You can take the land with you wherever you go, just like your medicine. Some of the terms that I found are so I come from a long history of working with my people. So my first job as a youth was working in the Edmonton Remand Center. I was 17 years old and I did 2 years there as a court worker, and got to see firsthand the experience of people who are coming into conflict with the justice system. So I have long history of understanding the changes over time of how people are viewing the Indian problem. And so most people recognize that through policy and settling, that there has been, an upset to our way of life that continues. And so I just call attention to colonialism, the settling, and to again encourage you to look at how that still occurs today when we're considering policy and practice. Next slide, please. So this, I'm sure some of you are aware of the government approach to evidence-based approaches to drug policy. And so I find it fascinating to look back on all of the different strategies in the harm reduction history and what's been done and how it centers. And I know I don't have to explain to you that there's always opportunities to do better and to expand. And that's what I'm hoping that we're going to think about. Under this colonial policy, though, again, it could be quite a conversation to talk about how Indigenous peoples are actually met when we're considering these certain pillars of policy, and who knows how well or how they're not working. I'm going to move on. So again, recognizing that this is a drug poisoning crisis. At what point did we call it a crisis? I was looking through some of the evidence, the recognized evidence that comes from some of the reports from government. And I coming from an Indigenous, woman of the land view, the crisis occurs. Like I just have to acknowledge that it is still a painful situation for many of our people and our families. We had a gathering out at our center this past weekend. So we work out in Silver Sage Center. It's a beautiful rural space, and we're mobile from there. But we brought many people in, and we usually have an opportunity to share what is going on. And one of our members was so sad because they were bringing community members home this week. She said there was 5 individuals at one party that are no longer with us because of this crisis. So I really want to call attention to the different sources of, or the different perspectives of what that crisis is, that it has many levels, many layers. And with all of the technology and ability that we have, and we can't blame COVID for restrictions anymore, why are the resources not where they're needed? And who's actually calling attention to and making sure that we understand within our communities that this is not going away, it's changing. Next slide, please. I just, again, looking at some of the information that comes off of our health analytics and doing just a quick view, it reminds me of how some of our knowledge keepers say, each of those numbers, each of those deaths are an individual. And to have it coldly stated that 1.2 1.2K or 1.6K, right? Like to try to emphasize how significant this problem is. It comes back for us, our strength, and many people use the storytelling. That's what we're finding is those personal testimonies bring the life back to this situation. Next slide, please. Indigenous healing. So I mentioned earlier that identity is a major issue for Indigenous, and I was looking at my own history, and I've gone through, the first 20 years of my life, I was Métis, had a Métis card. The next 30 years of my life, I became First Nation with not full complete status. In the last how many years of my life, and it's my special day, I became a fully, like, I have all of my rights again as a First Nation woman. That identity shifting is very complex, and it creates quite a bit of problematic ways that we look at Indigenous healing. So I just want to make sure that we know that it's not, again, one size fits all, that we come with a number of different issues. And one of those things that I'll mention just in the critiques is this use of trauma, and how trauma and words like reconciliation are problematic. This connection, discomfort. They say that culture is a connector, and culture is something that can help people to get well. We still have those discussions in our communities with some of our knowledge keepers and ceremonial holders as to how do we make people believe that they actually are part of and belong to our communities and can have access to solutions or ways of healing. The compassion and understanding, again, I have recognized that people will use a lot of lip service and what I call the surface knowledge of people. And this is, again, encouraging each of you that are in the discipline, in the field, to be aware of where you come from. And I know that there's many people who have much more lived experience than I, working through the challenges of, why do we need harm reduction? For Indigenous people and for other people, and I'll explain this in the next slide, I believe, a little more, that in our community, harm reduction is viewed as a very short-term Band-Aid fix. We look at the harm, what does harm mean? What's the context it's being used? How do we reduce that? And it's a much bigger issue and needs to look at what is the long-term approach that we need to consider when we're working with people, not just to keep people alive, but to actually move them through to a place of thrivance. One of the things that we, in asking, a number of different venues, people where we meet people where they're at, like go out in the truck and meet them on the land or on the street or in the community or in the hall. We did a little bit of our research and asked what's the biggest need that people have related to this. And people are talking about access to cultural supports. They need to be in places on the land. I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I'm going to just do a couple of things. So in the field, like sometimes adopting philosophies and principles is really easy. So harm reduction, I have loved harm reduction since I ever heard about it, and took it, right through to getting chiefs' endorsement in their resolutions to ensure that there were harm reduction programs. When I started to take it apart a little bit deeper, like have a deeper look at it, I thought that I would be alone in my critique. But I actually was able to pick up this publication, and I've noted the source, from Stella. And this is, again, centered around sex workers' rights. But I really liked some of their critiques. So reflecting on how we use the language of harm reduction, that there are different contexts. In my little bio and picture, I had a picture of a seatbelt, and I just laughed because often the seatbelt is the reference to this is harm reduction. Well, recognizing that context is important, and that when we think of harm reduction or Indigenous harm reduction, and the use of other terms like the decolonization, indigenous, there are distinctions between the provision of harm reduction supplies and the bigger issue of reducing harm that's been caused by colonialism and other issues. So I really love the point about it not crowding out other conversations, that we're not still here to be saved or, given things to keep us alive for another day, that we are working towards this idea of thrivance and transformation. And again, they laid out some really good points, and I would encourage you, if you're looking at the bigger conversations around harm reduction in different areas, to take a look at that report. I'd mentioned, the idea of identity. So many of the funding calls that we go to, there's this always having to, tie it to Indigenous peoples, Indigenous populations. So really being, just to emphasize that identity is very complex and the one size does not fit all. I know everybody already knows that, but I emphasize that the idea of harm reduction, as is in the, the conversation, that it can mean many things to different people. And there is, I extend gratefulness to the work that's been done, but I'm now looking at what's the contribution to a healthier health outcomes for Indigenous people, or better life outcomes for Indigenous people. How does harm reduction fit in that conversation? I put the tea haze up here. This is one of my current things. And this is coming from the danger of becoming an academic person who is on the land and is hearing at many different tables the trauma-informed provision of care and service. And so what we're saying many times now to people is that's a catch-all, it's a haze, it's non-specific. And so if you want to help us to address trauma, please be clear. What do you mean by trauma? What trauma are you actually seeking to remedy? Because until we can clearly identify what that trauma is, whether it's the taking of the land, the sexual abuse, the violence, the discrimination, the racism, and the specific incidents, trauma-informed is a very good catch-all phrase. So I'm putting that out there, and I hope that pisses people off. That your trauma-informed care, I'm sorry, if you haven't taken some really deep look at how you are approaching our people and it's still the surface, we recognize it. We recognize it. And that comes into the thing around reconciliation as well. We've had the whole thing around the apologies and the different ways of trying to assist our people to be better or to, repair the harms. Again, the harms occur at different levels, and to know what our tactic or strategy is for addressing them is important. Some people use we're going to go into reconciliation. Again, beautiful terms, just like the decolonization, the indigenization. And I call attention to the Reservation Dogs, season 2, episode 6. And if you look at that decolonization and you see yourself, we are laughing at you, with you, and hope for change. This comes into the idea of transformation, that there is an opportunity, always opportunity to do better. And I hope that some of this conversation sparks that. Next slide, I think I'm getting through, almost done. So just decolonization, of course, there's a spectrum. We say, give us our land back. You say, well, we already paid for it. I've got my lease, my mortgage, my whatever. No, there's a bigger conversation. We should not have homelessness in our own lands, and we have to think of better ways to do that. So how are we repairing again the damage that's been done and endures? I would say this still endures. Next slide. So coming back to beautiful teachers. So the tree of creation that I showed you earlier, the frame, one of our elders, so Joe P. Cardinal, he was from Saddle Lake, he's passed on. He was a veteran, and he taught us a lot about comradeship, communication, discipline as principled ways of doing what we're doing to help others. And this is central to many, many communities, that love is our strongest medicine. how we learn to bring this to what we do and how we live is very important. Next slide. That is it. Thank you so much.
Denise, thank you. That you were worried about how much time you were going to take on doing this, but the economy of words and the level of depth that you've gone on to in some very poignant topics, like the T-Haze concept alone. I got so many things to ask you about later on that, right? I mean, and also just understanding what your journey of transition from identifying with one community to another. I've got another question about that. We're going to talk about that later too. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your experience with us, Denise. Thank you so much. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to bring your attention to our next speaker. Of course, that'll be Emma from the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. Welcome. What's going on, pal, in the neck of your woods?
Yeah, so ani koe Emma Indigenous makanak kandoram Sharbet Lake Indigenous megwa Lekwangin and Da. Hello, good morning, everyone. My name's Emma. I'm an Anishinaabe from Sharbet Lake, which is a small little community in Southern Ontario. And I let my coworker choose my bio for today, which is why there was a cute little line about how old I am in there. So I apologize for scaring anyone. That's not usually necessarily in there, but it is true. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we work as a youth organization. I saw that. I respect it. So today, our presentation is titled after a recent book chapter we just did. We'll be there later. And it's We Go Where Our People Are, Indigenizing Harm Reduction. Next slide, please, Carly. So who are we? So I'm here from the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, and we're an intergenerational network led by Indigenous youth working throughout the United States and Canada across issues of sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice. What does that mean? It means that we have youth leaders working in our communities as far down south as New Mexico, as far north as Iqaluit, in Nunavut and Nome, Alaska, so the Arctic Circle, and coast to coast pretty much. I'm as far west over here on Vancouver Island in Lekwangin homelands. And reproductive health, rights, and justice is the space we started in, but we really know that this means everything and anything to do with our bodies and our spaces. Next slide, please, Carly. So to sort of complexify that a little bit, we have this super long list, and this is normally the time where I would ask if anybody feels like they have an especially sexy voice today and would like to read all of this out for us. Instead, I will invite you to sort of on your own time, find where your eyes are wandering to, and just like approach it with some curiosity. There might be some words that you haven't heard before or encountered before, or things where you're like, I wonder what that means. If anybody has like one that's burning right away, you're welcome to write it down in the chat box or quickly unmute and I can talk about it. Or you're also welcome to write it down and bring it up later. While you're thinking about whether you want to do that or not, I'll just keep talking a little bit and I'll say the idea of continuing to put this big list in is to really make clear that we have never gotten the privilege to be single issue people. And actually you're doing a really big injustice to us, or we're doing an injustice to us if we're trying to only look at like suicide rates and only reduce our community to our suicide rates without also looking at the impact of resource extraction and what it means for how you think of your role in community if you can't provide for your own family because your cycle of food sovereignty was disrupted, or or your understanding of self was never supported because you didn't have access to a rite of passage, or because colonialism has implemented a gender binary. Okay, fabulous question. Culturally safe sex ed. We often use the phrase, we didn't need Columbus to teach us about sex. There's this idea that we just didn't know what we were doing, and it's very fucked up. It's patriarchal, it's bullshit. And actually, Indigenous folks have had medicines and practices for managing our fertility and our sexual health since time immemorial. And so culturally safe sex ed, we'll talk a bit more about what cultural safety means later. But basically it looks at like by and for us sexual health education. And sometimes that takes place on the land. Sometimes that takes place with elders. We also like to say your cookum knows about sex. How did you think you got cookum, meaning grandma? How did you think you got here? So where does the colonial norm that we can't talk with our old people about sexual health come from? And also, like, how do we support you to actually put that into practice? Because it's terrifying to talk with your grandma about sex. Okay, let's go to the next slide, and I promise we'll get to cultural safety. All right, so harm reduction as a way of life. So today we're here to talk about harm reduction as our area of work. This is one of our core values at the network. So because we're going like anything and everything to do with our bodies and spaces, communities focus in on different areas. But what makes you a NYSHN youth leader is that whenever you're doing any of our areas of work, you're moving with these values in mind, and you're also thinking about how it intersects with other areas. So this is one of our core values here at NYSHN. And I'll just read it briefly. I know everyone loves when someone reads from the slide, but harm reduction as a way of life means that we, as well as our ancestors, have been keeping our communities safe and reducing harms long before the word harm reduction came into the English language. It's about reducing the many harms in our lives, not limited to just substance use. For example, colonialism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia, and criminalization, through the tools that work best for us, without stigma or judgment. We also don't define what harm is for other people. So this isn't a super interactive PowerPoint, so where normally we might talk more about this in dialogue, we'll do that later. I'll just highlight, for one, challenging the idea that harm reduction comes from outside of our communities. Many of us see harm reduction as deeply intertwined in the teachings from our specific nations, myself included. And also, we want to think about knowing that our communities had ways to reduce harm and navigate harm and risk pre-colonization. For instance, are you going to set up camp on the place right on like a frozen lake where you might fall through the ice? Or are you going to set up camp somewhere else? Well, we're going to practice some harm reduction, but we'll talk more about harm reduction in teachings later as well. And then the other big one is not defining what harm is for other people. This one can get really tricky for folks. And we ask that we get really, really specific about where we think harm and risk is. Carly, can you go to the next slide, please? From deficit models to ancestral strengths. So we need to understand that young people are not at risk by ourselves. There are certain things in our lives like racism that make our lives less safe. Let's commit to naming the risk instead of blaming young people for the violence they experience. So when we're always talking about Native youth have risk rate, or Native youth are at increased risk for pregnancy or STDs or death, whatever it is that they're saying these days. The problem with that statement is that it places the risk on being Native and being youth, when actually we know that these are some of our greatest superpowers. Being Native connects us to deep lineages of care and resources, connects us to our land. It resources us a lot, actually. And being young also resources us to ask questions like why. It puts us in this position of power in our lives. And what really is putting us at risk here is colonialism, right? So let's commit to naming that risk and looking for and supporting people to name where the harms are in their lives. Next slide, Carly. Yeah, we've been reducing the harms of colonialism for over 500 years. So this piece of art by Erin Consmo also just sort of challenges the idea that harm reduction is only about substance use or sex, by also looking at sort of wrap up the tip is like a condom use slogan in our sexual health work that we encounter a lot, but also looking at wrapping up the tar sands, and knowing that Indigenous organizing around environmental violence and the tar sands and resource extraction is intricately linked to our organizing around harm reduction. It is harm reduction. Next slide. We're zooming right along, folks. Okay, so you already kind of saw, we're getting into our 4 fires model, which Carly asked that I spend some time with you all today. So lovely. Denise already sort of talked a little bit about the 4 pillars. So I'm like, great. I didn't want to talk about that anyway. I'm so glad. Thank you, Denise. Kimamow. So yeah, this is a policy way of thinking about harm reduction. And it doesn't come from our communities. And one of my favorite aunties at our network likes to say, you know, what are these 4 pillars holding up? Colonialism, right? These pillars about prevention and like public health, harm reduction, around enforcement, these don't come from our communities, and actually often don't work for our communities. Next slide. So we wanted to create something different that acknowledged the strengths of our communities, that acknowledges the ways that we have been reducing harms, that acknowledges the ways that mainstream models don't always fit for our northern, rural, or remote communities, or for our teachings. And absolutely, I'll stand with Denise to say that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And we talk a lot about the sort of challenge with being prescriptive. People often want us to come and answer all the questions for us and just tell them what to do. And that's not what works. And actually, that's not her, that's counter to our value of self-determination, I would say. And we often ask to like have a gentle reminder about like, what is so uncomfortable about providing people with the information to make decisions for themselves in their own circumstances? People really want like a prescription, right? Like here's your model that will solve your problems, instead of to receive like tools and informations and have more agency about interpreting them for their own situations. Next slide. So this is what we came up with. This is our 4 fires model. It's like 7 years old or something now. So we have been recently updating, but it still has some really great medicine in it. So I'll start at the top and we'll work our way kind of clockwise. And I will create so much space in the back half of our time together to talk more if you have questions. So just thinking about cultural safety. So cultural safety, we talked about culturally safe sex ed. We're getting back to it. So cultural safety is a term that comes from our Maori relatives in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, specifically Maori nurses. And they ask that we all acknowledge the power differences that exist between service providers and client and patients. So in harm reduction, sometimes we talk about this means that like the clinic model might not be a model that works for everyone or anyone in our communities. And so thinking beyond the clinic model, but also just more practically, cultural safety looks like really asking our non-Indigenous practitioners to really think about their power differentials and name those with the Indigenous young people that they're supporting. Yeah, and understanding that our folks have experienced a lot of harm within medical settings and that there's really very real barriers to accessing care there. Reclamation, colonialism has uprooted and distorted many of our structures and ways of life, and reclaiming cultural practices can strengthen us. This is so true, right? This is about challenging the idea that colonial models could work for us or would work for us, and challenging the idea that we don't already have what we need within our communities, that our communities are only places with deficit instead of places with strength and creativity and resources. So for reclamation, sometimes this looks like working with knowledge keepers to think about, sometimes our communities put up barriers to folks who use substances to come into ceremony, right? You have to be sober for this many days before you can come to a sweat lodge. Not all lodge keepers will do that. And so we often engage our relatives to think about, well, what are the risks with someone coming to a sweat lodge ceremony? Okay, dehydration, you're losing a lot of water. So if someone's been drinking a lot previous to the ceremony, they might be at increased risk of dehydration. Okay, well, instead of an abstinence model, what can we do to support that? We can sit them closer to the door so it's less hot. We can have somebody on hand to support them if they're feeling dizzy to leave the space. We can ask them to drink a lot of water and just have lots of water. And we can make it so that they can come and go as they need to, right? So there's often these practical protocols that we can implement to support our folks, even when people want to put up a barrier. So self-determination, again, sort of thinking about it's not one size fits all, and it's going to look different in all of our communities. And that's part of the beauty and magic of it. And sovereignty is really tied to self-determination, and it also I think really challenges the enforcement model and the pillars. You can't force somebody into treatment. And so instead we want to think about support, not shame, or support, not stigma, which also looks like, some of our, Denise talked so greatly about identity. Some of our young folks are really disconnected from ceremony, and ceremony doesn't feel like a safe or helpful space to them. So not judging or shaming a young person if they want to go for more quote unquote mainstream models of treatment, but also conversely, not forcing someone into treatment because that's fucked up. Okay, next slide, please. Again, could you click? Yes, I think my coworker Shane has done something fancy here with animations, and I love that for us.
Transitions and slides, man.
Wow, is it 2006 or what? So here's another way of looking at them. I guess I'll add an example. We ask people to think about getting specific about what risk is, right? And so, sometimes we see our drug use is, our drinking is harmful, right? You can't be in the halfway house or in the foster home if you're drinking. But also what's harmful is being kicked out of your housing in the winter in Northern Alberta. And so where's the greater risk there? And what are our other options? Can you click again twice? There's going to be a center fire. So we think about what do the 4 pillars uphold? Colonialism. But what can these fires support? Whatever and whoever we put in the center. Okay. Let's go next slide, please. Yeah, well, that's kind of me talking at you. And I wanted to provide some examples of what we're doing, right? That's the sort of theoretical frameworks. We wrote that. So next slide, we'll zoom along. Yeah, this was at a funeral turned summit for one of the young people in the Syilx Nation. So in the middle photo, the person in the purple shirt is a Nishan mentor or relative who's lost a number of nieces and nephews and niblets to accidental drug overdose, basically poisoning of supply. And so their community gathered up resources when they lost another young person to host a summit to talk about safer use and also what's going on. So you can see my suitcase that I packed full of naloxone kits. We went to their band's wellness center and we made punk patches and we demonstrated naloxone use and talked about that. Next slide. When we're talking about cultural safety, you'll see we also help in the feast area. This is my friend and co-hustler Shane, who chose that bio for me and also is here helping prepare the food for the feast and the giveaway that happened later. So oftentimes harm reduction can be wrapped up in ceremony and just an integrated part of our nation's protocols and practices. Next slide. Baby raising always involves harm reduction. Clearly, I am an active harm reductionist in this photo, very, very much supporting the raising of this child. You'll see I'm on the far left, and there's my friend Shane, more clearly helping and supporting a young person to reduce the harms of whatever they'd like to put in their mouth in that moment. Next slide. So another example closer to me is the Indigenous harm reduction team, independent by and for group, folks who use criminalized substances, specifically like injection drug use. We recently got an in-person space, but also we've been hosting healing circles for many years now. So a space for you to come, just talk about your substance use or your relationship to community, to take medicines, food, and also have the opportunity to be brushed off by an elder, which is something we really don't always have access to when we're navigating like urban street experiences. So the principle is we all deserve access to medicine and healing. Next. Yeah, I love these photos. This is us at the back to school fair in a local community. We were invited in, and I love the intergenerational aspect of this family learning about how to use naloxone and normalizing it. Like there were a lot of little kids. This is my friend Terry, who came to help me out with harm reduction education. And so I'm doing like sexual health, talking with 6-year-olds about pooping and the rectums on the one side, and Terry's sharing about safer using practices on the other. Next. We've got a very limited amount of time. I think I just wanted to provide you with some other thinkers about harm reduction and Indigenous harm reduction before we were done. So I'm going to breeze through a couple quotes, and then we'll be done. So just to always complexify the idea that one person or one organization even can ever speak for the whole, and give you some other thoughts. So next. This is one of our other core values. So what it connected to body, connected to land means what happens to our, we recognize that what happens to our lands, good, bad, and everything, also happens to our bodies and our communities. So when we talk about harm reduction for our bodies, we're also looking at harm reduction for our lands, which we touched on earlier. Let's go to the next slide and think more about that. Oh, this one, okay. This is from, I'll put this in the resource list. I forgot this was still in here. This is Erin Consmo, who used to be an NT for our network. And this is a quote in a recent article, like chapter she had. So for me, this, she's talking about harvesting birch bark from trees that were logged and left behind in the logging on her home territories. And she says, for me, this feels like ethical harvesting inside a world that continues to be, oh God, my screen just disappeared. Oh, continues to be destroyed by extreme extractivism. It spoke to me because I felt like those trees are similar to the people who are left behind in the rubble of colonialism. Trees that had been through logging, devastation, but still had ways to contribute. I can't help but hope that whenever I'm left in the rubble, that someone will still be able to see me for what I can share and the medicines I provide. So thinking about the ways that our people and our communities have been shaped and changed by colonization, but also the ways where our teachings are, we all have medicines to offer. So the top right photo is from my auntie's house. Like 8 years ago, I got sent out to harvest cedar, and I harvested cedar from the hedges in the neighborhood in downtown Toronto, because that's the cedar that's on hand. And I did it with protocol, but thinking about like, those were private property hedges, but this is also cedar that my auntie needed to be well. Next. Yes, I'm gonna read a little quote from Erica Violet Lee, who is a fabulous Nahia philosopher from the prairies, and her wasteland theory. Next. Okay. Spaces that are considered not simply unworthy of defense, but deserving of devastation are named wastelands. Wastelands are places where no medicines grow, only plants called weeds. A wasteland is a place where, we are taught, there is nothing and no one salvageable. A wasteland is a person denied safe haven because she is full of the chemicals that make survival less painful. Wastelands are spaces deemed unworthy of healing because of the scale and amount of devastation that has occurred there. Next. Wastelands are named wastelands by the ones responsible for their devastation. Next. Once they have devastated the earth, logged the forest bare, poisoned the water, turned our neighborhoods into brown fields so we must grow vegetables in pots above the ground. Once they have consumed all that they believe to be valuable, the rest is discarded. But the heart of Wasteland's theory is simple. Here we understand that there is nothing and no one beyond healing. So we return again and again to the discards, gathering scraps for our bundles, and we tend to the devastation with destabilizing gentleness, carefulness, and softness. Next. For those of us in the wastelands, for those of us who are the wastelands, caring for each other in this way is refusing a definition of worthiness that will never include us. Yeah. So that's sort of another quote that looks at the connection between body and land. I know, right? It's pretty fucking badass. And then I just included some posts about practice as well. Baby Yoda is a native meme at this point. So here's Baby Yoda offering up some naloxone, but also water is life, and thinking about water is life for our folks who use substances. So if you're in a community that has a boil water advisory, what does that mean if you're trying to cook up your substance before injecting it, right? We need to have access to safer or sterile water. So this is a relative who includes that and ships it to northern communities. Next. And then this is hopefully our last quote from one of my aunties. And she says, I have learned that people under the influence of drugs or alcohol should not be using the sacred medicines. Yet in my work as a social worker and truly in my own life, it is sometimes those times that I need the help of medicine most. Who am I to say that the drunk man on the street cannot breathe the sweet smell of Wingash? So thinking about here, there's an ethic of self-determination and sovereignty. Who am I to interfere with this person's sovereignty and self-determination to say that Wingash is the medicine that would be helpful to them? And there's also a belief that our medicines are strong enough to take care of themselves. Is a teaching from a grandmother, Wanda Whitebird in Toronto, who's Alnu or Mi'kmaq, and challenging this idea of purity, right? That the medicines must stay pure, or that any of us are pure anymore under colonialism. We've all been shaped by colonialism, and we all also carry medicine. Next. All right, we did it. Miigwech, many thanks, y'all. So we recently had a book chapter in this book called Saving Our Own Lives, a liberatory practice of harm reduction. And if you wanted to hear more thoughts, you can read them in the book if you wanted. Or, you can check it all out for free on the internet. So we'll include some links in the resource list. Thank you all so much. Miigwech.
Emma, thank you. Listen, I mean, I know it's my job to do these things, but it's such a pleasure and privilege to be able to hear, kind of world-shattering, world-altering, concepts coming out every couple of months. So thank you so much, both Denise and Emma, for adding new data to the equation of life, forcing us to change our perspective on the entire system. So thank you for that enlightenment. To allow you to some rest and to give everybody else a bit of a moment of pause to consume and process everything you've just had your brains spread across toast like peanut butter for. Let's take a 5-minute bio break, and then we'll come back in and we'll have some questions for our wonderful speakers. So please go do your thing. Coming back in 5 minutes. If you're not here, we're going to talk about you behind your back. I'm literally watching you manually do a fade out.
I'm not a DJ.
Well, not with that attitude, pal. Everybody's a DJ if they're brave enough. I know that we are on camera. Hey, listen, Carly, good pick for this week's or this month's transitional time frame. Hey, Alana, that was a nice candle you've got lit there. Yeah, I'm sure what that is. So good picks for tunes. Gotta love lo-fi beats. We'll give a few moments for people to pile back in, but I got some hard pressing questions to ask my two lovely speakers today, our two lovely speakers. Just, I mean, as a guy that's been in this field for 3 times probably Emma's age now, which kills me. Like, by the way, Emma, my career is, I think, twice your age. Anyway, or my career is definitely older than you. But thank you. Don't agree with me. Don't agree with me. That's not what I want to hear right now. But it's so refreshing, right? It's so nice to know that we are talking about how the systems that we were taught, the systems that we use to help folks, are really just upholding the status quo and really only benefiting, the people who reap the benefits of status quo. It's just nice to, as a person that happens to not be a white guy, have that vocalized, after feeling that for so long. It's kids are all right, man. You guys are doing just fine. I'm only 41. I just want to put that out right now. Okay. That's it, guys. 42 in February. Don't do that, Carly. Okay. Well, I see some cameras pop. Thank you for laughing. Those people who are laughing at me. All right, folks. Welcome back to our COP. I thought, this is your opportunity to sort of pop some questions in. Lana, you're the worst. Nobody look at the chat right now. So if you're interested in asking questions, feel free to raise your hand. Carly will unmute you to ask those questions, probably in the time that Carly saw you raise your hand. If you're not sure how to raise your hand in these things, if you kind of highlight your mouse down to the bottom of our chat window, hit the reactions button. There should be a way to raise your hand there. Lana, we're supposed to be friends, and then but also, if you aren't keen on jumping onto the camera to ask a question, feel free to just type it into the chat, and we'll load it up on the hopper, and I'll ask that question for you to save yourself having to hop on camera if you're not comfortable with it. But let me ask this one question first, and I'm going to direct this question first at Denise, and then I'll have a question for you as well, Emma, afterward, just so we give some folks to. Every one of you are telling us how old you are comparatively to me. We'll get those questions out. So first, Denise, thank you again for speaking with us. But I just wanted to know more so maybe on like a personal level, right? I mean, when you were talking about the concepts of like T-haze as an approach, right, for that trauma-induced umbrella that we kind of bludgeon everything with, right? In regards to its approach to addressing trauma, right? How does that strategy in and of itself, does it essentially just work to homogenize, right, individual groups and communities, right? That lack of specificity that you were talking about, right? Is that not just another tool in white supremacy as a whole? What are your thoughts on that, Denise?
Looking for my unmute button. Yeah, I think with the imposition of some of the discipline discourse or the different sector language that is used, I think it keeps it focused, it contains it. So one of the other things that I'm looking at is containment. strategies of Indigenous peoples, and that can be, you know, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, social, policy-wise, right? Focusing on the trauma, keeping it trauma-centered, trauma-focused, harm reduction is not doing anything about aspiring for improving health, improving quality of life, reducing what we actually, and so this is a plug for Kimamow in some of our ways. We have now started to take on some of this idea of tracking what's going on with people, the people that we love and the people that we work with. And we've actually on a recent intake form added a little area for colonial irritants.
Please
You can
elucidate
adopt
that for us. Would you just, would you expand on that? I would love to hear just a little bit more on that, because, you know, we collect a lot of data too, you know, and I just
well, I want people to know that there's always a different shift. So while we're having to, you know, report for projects and programs and, you know, the data collection, we try to make it as useful as possible, right? And so besides the demographic and, you know, and we're talking about, are we providing information on this, or are we actually taking somebody to a service or providing that support? We kept getting this, well, I'm not going there because I'm just a tick on their Indigenous box, right? And take
it's
that,
the triviality of your culture, right?
Right. Or that they're very, they look down on me, or the racism and the discrimination that occurs within long-standing systems and structures. There was no way to talk back. People are not going to go back to the patient's advocate, or, you know, how many of our organizations have internal kind of ways of speaking back? Well, we're taking that information and calling it colonial irritant. So is somebody looking at you with disdain? Describe what that looks like. Are they calling you or treating you different because you're Métis or you're Treaty or you're Inuit or you're without an address, right? So we're tracking like how many of the people that we work with are being, and to use an addiction word, triggered by the service providers or the workers that are actually an irritation, because we are more informed. We're colonially informed now.
I'm having a hard time staying neutrally present and non-biased in all this, because so listen, Denise, coffee sometime, you and I want to bring, thank you for sharing that. It's a really interesting way to collect data. I'm just going to try to keep that in confines of boundaries of work. Hey, Nikita's got a question. Nikita, did you want to pop up? Or Natika, sorry, I read that wrong. My apologies.
Yeah, no worries. It's actually Natica. So.
Cool. I did it wrong twice.
Okay. Thank you both, Emma and Denise, for your presentations. I wrote a lot of notes on that, on those. So I live in I'm calling in from the unceded ancestral territory of Kamloops to Secwepemc within the Secwepemc Ulu in Kamloops, BC. And I'm the coordinator of the CAT group here, which is a community action team, and they're funded throughout British Columbia to address harm reduction. It used to be the opioid crisis, now it's toxic drug supply crisis, and it's escalating, of course. But one of the things I was wondering is, in BC, the data on the impact on Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit is invisible, with exception to the data that's, sorry, my computer's dinging. With exception to the data that's compiled by First Nations Health Authority, which is only First Nations data that's collected in community or on reserve. And so our coroner's reports, they're differentiated by age and gender, but that's it. So I have some real concerns about the fact that there is literally no data talking about the number of overdose deaths that occur with with Indigenous people. And I'm wondering if that's different in other provinces, but I almost feel, especially because Indigenous youth are so impacted by this. My daughter's community has lost a number of young people. In Kamloops, they've lost lots of young people. The delegated child welfare agency here was, my friend was saying that they're drumming once or twice a week for children that they're losing to overdose death. And yeah, like, how do we advocate for data? And I know that I just feel like it's just like, it just reminds me, and this might not be appropriate, but it feels almost like it was like the residential school systems, the 60 scoop, now the current child welfare system, and now the current toxic drug supply crisis. Like, children are literally disappearing and there's no information on that. Anyway, I'm just wondering if that's come up in your work at all.
Emma, did you want to respond to that?
I don't know. I'm wondering if maybe you might speak to the not to stereotype you as a stats proficient, fabulous PhD student, but I'm wondering if you might be able to speak to the stats side and what it's like in Alberta, and I could speak a little bit to the sort of youth organizing side.
Right. So I find it fascinating to look at that whole stat epi piece. And so my motivation, be careful of the words you use out there with young people and older people. My motivation for going back to school was the use of two words: disproportionate overrepresentation of Indigenous, Native, Indian peoples, right? Those two words were used so much, and it's still like the data that we have here. There were attempts, reports that were actually done that were First Nation specific. And I know that the Métis Nation of Alberta has entered into some data collection agreements where they're able to get specific numbers. Again, it goes back to how people are identifying, how they're engaging in the system. For many years, especially in the HIV world, people would go into a doctor, and I think this may happen with other, other health issues as well, that the medical or professional would look at someone and decide whether they were Native or not without asking the question, just by how they looked physically. There is a benefit. There's a couple of drawbacks I just want to point out, and I wanted to make sure that this is mentioned and noted around policy, that for First Nations where there are data sharing agreements, you'll have First Nation specific data. The challenges for those that may not be status or may self-identify or may not be part of those specified groups. One of the things that I find just on this note of identity and access to health services and being able to say how significant an issue is, we have a number of people who have been able to get First Nation status in this country as a result of different policy and legal challenges. And this is fairly recent, and yet we have individuals, First Nations people right across the country, who cannot access the medical dental services because they don't have their status card. And that whole policy process is something that really needs to be identified. I think there will be opportunities for better surveillance and monitoring, but yeah, it's a poor state. Sorry, going on and on. Emma.
Thank you, Denise. Yeah, I hear you. I think that's a really, it's not an easy situation we're all sitting with. We're all losing loved ones. I think from the NYSHN and youth organizing and sort of grassroots side of things, what I can offer is a sort of gentle challenge as to why do we need data? Why do we need data? It sounds like you and your team and your relatives and your community really know a lot about how many folks you're losing, what that feels like, what that impact feels like, how that's impacting all different areas of your community. And so sometimes we want to challenge, like, what is the utility of data and for who? So data can be used to try and get the recognition of the federal government, right? And people hope that that recognition will get you more funding. But for Indigenous communities, fighting for recognition is a double-edged sword, because it's not in the Canadian government's interest to revitalize our nations. It's in the Canadian government's interest to keep stealing our land and to keep our people unwell to some degree, so that we don't have sovereignty over our lands, right? So, absolutely, I have some warrior aunties who are doing amazing things in academia with numbers and words that sometimes make it so that money gets to me down the pipeline so that I can pay for people's gas or to treatment or gas to the res or what have you. And also, with it comes all these questions like, who will own the data? These also like methodological questions like, yeah, how would you even, like FNHA specifically, I think usually collects data for folks who have status, but a lot of our communities living like in urban areas or off reserve aren't really necessarily connected with their Indian status and might be seeking support from other treatment centers where they might not want to self-identify. And I guess the other thing is what story will people tell with the data, right? Once there's a set of numbers, you get also like non-Indigenous researchers who get to tell a story with those numbers, right? That's where the question of who owns the data comes in. And what story will they tell? Will they tell a story that Indigenous youth are dead and dying and we're just victims? And what story will they tell about the solution? Will they say that more of us need to be taken into foster care? Will they say that our families are unfit? Will they say that the Canadian state is the source of the harm here? Will they say that we need to have national sovereignty back? This is the other thing that comes with numbers, right? Is that they detach from the story, right? Because I'm sure those folks at that healing center who are doing that drumming could tell you a story, and I'm sure you could tell me a story right now about what would be needed or helpful, right? So why the numbers? But yeah, I hope that helps. Thanks.
Data without context is dangerous, right? And then what you're talking about is who controls that context. That's what a lovely day. Brilliant. Thank you. I hope I'm not sure that answers your question. Marlene, I see that your hand's up. Welcome. Feel free to unmute and ask your question. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Calling in today from the traditional territory, the Nanaimo First Nations, otherwise known as Nanaimo, BC. Hi, Emma. Hi, Denise. Thank you for your presentation. It's a beautiful day here. Thank you for the question that was just asked around data. First Nations Health Authority, I am their Indigenous harm reduction educator for the Coast Salish families, and I've been doing this for 18 months. And we also meet with Island Health. Island Health has created the community reporting tools, and First Nations Health Authority does collect data and is working with the coroners of BC to have sharing information agreements and what that looks like for our communities. It definitely is a process because of everything that Emma has said and Denise has said. So I have an employee of FNHA, and I know that we are working diligently to make sure that that happens in a really good way. Thank you for the question, and everybody, thank you for your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee, for sharing that. I appreciate that too. Certainly Beverly says in the comments that, you know, we have people who go into hospitals and are sent home once vitals are checked at emergency and sent back onto the streets with no follow-up. And most Indigenous feel like no one cares about them because of the aftercare. There is no documentation, and most information is spread by the client themselves or family members on overdose. This is how we have been extracting our data. Right. And that's an interesting concept too, Beverly. Thank you for sharing that, right? Because then who also authenticates the data, who also states that this data is more valid than X, that data as well, right? Without that context too, you know, and oftentimes that I would argue that would be considered anecdotal and then stricken, you know, even though that is absolutely not, it is absolutely a human being that experienced that, right? So why is that data not important either? Thank you, Beverly, for sharing that thought too. Again, the floor is certainly open for other folks to come and ask questions, but Emma, I promised you a question earlier too that I didn't get a chance to, so hold on to your butt for this one. So I had a question about resistance, right? So what does resistance look like, you know, when you were talking about challenging cultural norms, right? Even within you know, your own community, right? So when you challenge cultural norms within adjustments to you know, like a sweat lodge in regards to harm reduction and embracing harm reduction, how does that impact your community? How does that intermingling of concepts challenge the concept of identity? You know what I mean? Like, I mean, if I can give you an example, right? I mean, oftentimes I would do a thing and then my dad would say, well, that's not Chinese enough, or you're too Canadian or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like it's one could argue that it's not a clash, but certainly an intermingling of culture. Like what's been your experience with that?
Yeah, certainly. So I grew up on my home territories in Toronto or Tuglundo. So my home community is in Charlotte Lake, which is like an hour north of Kingston, if you know Ontario. But my mom moved us out when we were pretty young, and she was the first in our community to pursue and get a university degree, and she made a lot possible for us in our lives. So I really got my harm reduction teeth and bones on my home territory in Toronto, but also, you know, I challenge that because I really, really do believe that like the harm reduction that I practice, like harm reduction is the English word that helps us to gather together. But for me, it comes from my teachings. And so, you know, we have 7 grandparent teachings in Anishinaabe Nation. And one of those teachings is love. And we talk a lot about that. Like these are the core teachings that guide us in our work. And so I have never seen my traditional teachings as in conflict with the belief that all of our folks should have access to healing, to ceremony, to the healing that they know will be useful to them on their journeys. And through my life, limited as it may be in comparison to others, facilitating that has looked in different ways. It's looked like forming deep relationships with elders to ask questions about like, well, where does that come from? You know, there's an example we often use where like sometimes you'll ask an elder if there were ever any gay people around growing up. They're like, no, it's some new thing. And then you ask them, okay, well, was it ever the case that sometimes 2 men would live together and like have their own house, or 2 women would live together and have their own house? And then they'll tell you the story about 2 awesome women who lived together and took in all the orphaned kids on the res. And like, sometimes there's a dissonance, right, about what English words we use and what English terms we think work for our communities. So whereas harm reduction might seem like, oh my God, you know, I have a really scary experience with substance use. So that's not something I'm equipped to deal with. Reframing it as we are really equipped to deal with ceremony and with meeting people where they're at spiritually and with loving our people. So how can we support you to think about, or how can we support like everyone to be met where they're at here? So yeah, sometimes we've held ceremony with specific elders. Like, I don't want to cast all elders as like, you know, that's a stereotype. We can't cast all elders as not cool. Grandmother Wanda Whitebird in Toronto was one of the first Native people, at least the first in Ontario, to bring our medicines into the prison system, right? And then she got kicked out because they don't want our medicines in the prison system.
Is that the way?
Yeah, and she's been working with our folks on the streets who are HIV positive and using substances for decades. She's one of our, like, in some ways, as youth organizers, it's also our job to challenge the idea that we just popped out of the ground nowhere with all these ideas in our head. No, we have aunties and uncles and grandparents who shared their knowledge with us and raised us. And also sometimes it looks like holding ceremony for each other without any like quote unquote elder or knowledge keeper, and instead understanding all of us as having knowledge and having gifts and having the ability to hold ceremony or healing for each other. Specifically for like trans Native youth, this is like an intersection. Sometimes there's a gender binary in our ceremonies, and we have to ask, where does that come from? Ojibwe doesn't have he or she pronouns. It doesn't have a gendered pronouns. So where did this gender binary in our ceremony come from? Did it come from colonialism? Maybe. What would it look like to challenge that so that trans and non-binary young people can access ceremony? So yeah, there's an ongoing process and conversation, I think, that really also gets specific about like how have we been impacted by colonialism, and weighing our core values like love against like a protocol, like you have to wear a skirt to this thing. Well, we value love and self-determination. So if a young person experiences dysphoria and doesn't want to wear a skirt to a ceremony, then wouldn't we meet them where they're at so they can come as they are, right? So I'll stop now so we can have more discussion later.
Well, I think you're describing exactly what I was asking, right? I mean, that's a very clear description of that reception. So thank you for providing that for us. Marlene, welcome back, pal. Got your hand up. I'd give you a high five if I could.
Good morning again, everybody. Thank you for that discussion. Thank you for asking that question. I'm not from Vancouver Island, so I'm an uninvited guest for the last 25 years. And so I take a lot of honor in the job that I get paid to do. And so when I go into communities, I talk about helping us as Indigenous people, helping us remember our kinship laws. That's what Emma was talking about. So helping us remember our kinship laws and what that looked like and how we took care of people when they were not well, whatever that looked like, whether or not they had chicken pox or smallpox, or any other kind of spiritual unwellness. What did that look like? Because we all remember, we grew up and we are around and we heard conversations happening around us. And so the other thing that I do when I go into bigger circles like this is talk about how we as humans are the medicine, and that we need to continue to move the medicine with these type of conversations, because we all hold the medicine of love, care, kindness, compassion, truth, humility. We all hold that medicine and we need to continue to move it. When I go into communities, I talk about the Indigenous communities and remembering their medicine, because the ancestors have left medicine for them here on Vancouver Island. Whatever specific region you are to, the ancestors have left medicine there for you. The ancestors didn't leave medicine for me here on Vancouver Island. They left it here for the island people to remember and to pick up and to move that medicine to make ourselves more well and more strong for the things that we face today and the things that we face tomorrow. My medicine is back home and I carry that medicine. I carry my grandmother's medicine. So I love that these conversations happen, these sacred circles. So I enjoy being here. Thank you, everybody, for listening and sharing and helping move that medicine.
Thank you, Marlene. That's such a wonderful thing to say. I mean, it's yeah. I'm going to go into stuff about me, but we're not talking about that now. So thank you, Marlene, for sharing that. You know, I'm doing a lot of reading about epigenetics and stuff like that. So it's interesting that, you know, we're using quite a very colonialist concept to talk about that generational medicine. So thank you for bringing that up too. Denise, I've got another question specifically for you, if you don't mind as well. I wanted to ask you about if you wouldn't mind speaking to your experience of offering, you know, harm reduction in a rural community. I mean, we often know that harm reduction is, you know, it tends to be focused and only accessible to folks in like a metropolitan sort of scenario or an area. What does that look like for you in a rural situation? And also, if you wouldn't mind touching on the concept of what is stigma? How does stigma vary and differ, you know, considerably from a metropolitan scenario to more of a rural landscape? What do you think about that?
Well, I think on the first part, like around the harm reduction distribution of materials and supplies, and it kind of links in with the others. So when we had early needle exchange programs, they were very urban centered there, and people would have to come into the cities to do their needle exchanges. And then, of course, as the policies are changing, the distribution points are changing, and the government love or unlove of harm reduction comes and goes, right? People have had to be creative. And so in our approach, one of our central beliefs is that and I know it's central to harm reduction, is to meet people where they are at. So we organize activities in community. It may be with only a couple of people. It may be with a family. It could be a number of, you know, service providers or people who have a general or specific interest in making sure that people have access to not only the sexual harm reduction supplies, but also the drug using harm reduction supplies. So those are some of the distinctions. The stigma, when I think about the change over time, you know, injection drug use was such a stigmatized behavior early on in the HIV world. And now that we've kind of moved out into, you know, a range of other uses and misuses of drugs, the stigmatization I see in rural and smaller communities is centered at the people that are using particularly those stimulants that may cause obvious outbursts of behavior or chaos. And often those stories, you know, depending on the size of the community and how connected people are, like there is it's better to use fentanyl than it is to use meth, right? Like, so there's drug using stigma. There is this in the urban setting, people know where they can go to get some services, whether that's food or housing, or the resources, harm reduction resources. And so those visible stigmatized groups of people, that like it's something that's observable, more obvious than it is in a rural setting. I often think it takes more to work in the smaller rural setting to find the people and to develop that relationship. And so this again speaks to the harm reduction is not just the half an hour needle exchange or access to a consumption site. It is a long-term relational development, gaining the trust not only of the person who's using, but of the family and the support system. And I think those are sometimes lost in the discussion around harm reduction and what it means in a rural setting. I mean, we could go set up in a rural store somewhere, but the depth of that relationship and the opportunity for the change will be much different.
That is quite the multifaceted approach. So there's no Like, you gotta wonder how you're able to even navigate that at times. You know what I mean? Like that switching of mentalities and being able to be focused in like that. It's incredible that you're able to, you know, be so malleable in the approach. You know, I mean, you're absolutely embodying the concept of going where people need to be, but you know, it's such a difficult thing for people to be able to switch perspectives like that. So thank you.
Right.
Thank you for sharing that. I've got a question also for Emma too, if you don't mind as well. You know, when we think about harm reduction, right? I think we know that self-esteem has a place, but not quite how, you know, intrinsic or essential it is to have that resource of self-esteem to actually access services. You know, NYSHN helps youth, you know, and like clearly a large bullet point list of ways. How, if you can talk about, you know, what are some of the ways that you help integrate self-esteem, you know, with your community, and how does the impact of that work affect people's ability to access services at that point? Is that a component even?
Cool question. That's so fun. I don't think I've thought about the term self-esteem in relation to our work in a long time. To me, that feels like a little bit of like a middle school curriculum, like
all right,
eating disorder intervention, mainstream kind of model of like, we got to get the kids self-esteem.
All right.
But but when I think about what you're really asking, I see the utility to it, like outside of the framing.
What are you, my parents? Come on, like this.
And I think about, maybe there's a question in there about what does it mean to believe that we're deserving of care, and what does it mean to believe that we're deserving of care that meets us where we're at and meets our needs and is loving and like deeply relational. Because I think that I think that is often a barrier, right? Colonialism tells us that we're not worthy, that we're dirty, that we're inherently wrong, just as Native youth, right? That we take up too much time or space. And you got to think about, like, take up too much space because we take up the space on the land, and colonization would like to remove us from the land, right? This is the like sort of like galaxy brain level metric of how Indigenous folks are impacted by colonization. If you think about Black folks, some of the organizing there is around, well, Black bodies are used as labor. So there's a different kind of rhetoric or targeting that gets happened around labor and slavery histories. Whereas for Indigenous peoples, it's about removal and disappearance, right? And sometimes we're disappeared from our own bodies and lands even. There's this concept called terra nullius, which is a legal principle, meaning empty lands. It's the belief that the Indigenous lands have nobody to govern them, so that colonizers have an inherent right to come in and an obligation, when really we have intricate systems of governance across many nations. But sometimes at NYSHN, we talk about our bodies are not terra nullius. Our bodies are not without systems of governance either. And every Indigenous body is in itself a system of governance, carries with us the teachings. Even if we have a hard time seeing them in ourselves, we all carry with us some little piece of medicine, some little piece of love that it took to get us here. So I think when I think about self-esteem, I think that's what sort of comes to mind, is it's about sometimes the presencing of thinking that we are deserving of being able to belong in a space and to belong in our own futures, right? And I guess the other piece is just also not saying that you have to have this much not accepting that we should wait for each other to have this much self-esteem to get support, but moving beyond that and being like, so NYSHN shows up at the powwow. That's culturally safe sex ed also. We show up at the powwow with treats and games and puzzles and fun stuff to learn and access support. We show up at the All Native basketball tournaments. You know, I really, really deeply love and care for what Denise shared about how deeply relational this work is in rural and remote communities. I think about like one of my loved ones in Ganawage who does abortion support on the res. Doesn't work if it's not relational, right? She does everything out of her house. People need to know that that's the house they can go to, how they can go to it. People need to have an understanding of who you are in relation to them, whose sister went to high school with your brother's friend. It's very, very deeply relational. So I think the other component is, even as we're working with each other to build up and decolonize this idea that we're not deserving of like the care that our ancestors could dream of or that we would dream of for our future relatives, we're also not waiting for that to happen. We're going to be, right, looking to meet each other where we're at consensually. No one's getting forced into care, relationships of care they're not wanting. But yeah, we're not waiting for someone to be healed enough to come to the land. No, we're getting the land all around us. We're getting in touch with them.
Yeah, so there's like no quantum of pain, right? There's no, you have to be this tall to ride this ride. Everybody should be allowed to have access, right? Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Emma, for, you know, dragging me like that and embodying me as the, that's deserved. I appreciate it. You know, we have a few minutes left in today's COP. I wanted to make sure that the floor is open for anybody else to ask questions. I know I've been sort of monopolizing this because I'm a talky guy, but by all means, if you've got questions, feel free to raise your hand or pop them into the chat. You know, oh yeah, go ahead, Asha.
Hi, my name is Asha Bittenbender. I am a white settler and uninvited guest on traditional territory of the Kwanlin First Nation and the Tan-Quechan Council in Whitehorse in the Yukon. I work for Queer Yukon, and I'm taking on responsibility for a community space, which is why I'm here today. And I just wanted to oh, thank you. By the way, this has been a wonderful experience. Thank you so much for sharing your words and your thoughts. It's been so good. I wanted to ask you your perspective on how, this is way too general a question, but I'll leave it to you. Just some thoughts around how we can approach Indigenous harm reduction from the perspective of like one element of intersecting identities, because our space is one for queer people, but I think that the topics, but we also of course like serve Indigenous queer people and QT BIPOC people, and so I think that what was talked about here today is something that we can take on for the benefit of those community members and the queer community at large. I hope that's a question. I'll pass it to you.
Emma, would you like to translate?
Denise, spicy auntie, Denise, coming at it. Yes, I think that there's maybe a question about like, how can we think of Indigenous harm reduction frameworks as applicable outside of just substance use and outside of just like for Indigenous substance users? Maybe there's a little bit of something there. I think I talked a little bit earlier around like these principles of harm reduction have been used for a long time by trans Native folks. Yeah, and in a space that's not uniquely Indigenous. Trans Native youth have been reducing the harm that comes with transphobia in our ceremonial spaces, in our organizing spaces, in our decolonial spaces, right? And that's always about a metric of risk and also a metric of love and potential for not just risk, right? Our bodies are also potential for great things. So I think that's one example, is that I've heard of Queer Yukon, and I know there's like an Indigenous, Indigiqueer group up there, and y'all are super awesome. So I think like connecting there, right? And recognizing the ways that you're already reducing the harms or risks of capitalism, of colonialism, thinking about your space, right? Like, what would it mean for it to be safer in your space? Like what in your space is inherently a risk, right? For Indigenous youth, like, do you have hard deadlines about when people can apply for things? Because it doesn't matter like how many medicine wheels are on the wall everywhere. If I can't get like one-on-one support to fill out this paperwork that is totally not accessible, right? It's not a harm reduction space. And so thinking about like those systemic frameworks might be helpful. And also just listening and giving power back to your local Indigenous folks, because that's the other thing. Sometimes we see Indigenous folks are only represented on the front lines, and we're not in management of like harm reduction movements. We're not in management. We're not in like real power sharing, decision-making roles. So thinking about like, do you have Indigenous folks who access your space, and are those folks getting paid the like big bucks? I'm sure Queer Yukon does not necessarily have big bucks to share. Maybe you do. But in the proportion of resources that you have and decision-making power that you have in your organization, do Indigenous harm reductionists have that? Who has the power? Denise?
Excellent. I just, as a fierce auntie who was very loved by one of your co-founders, Jessica, it's like, oh, I feel I feel safe as an auntie, as a knowledge keeper, as one of those in the, holding a lot of the knowledge that it's been passed on well, and you are translating, and I'm speaking to you, Emma, you're translating what we need and do in a very thoughtful way, referring to the question in the translation. Like I resist as an older Indigenous woman, a mother, a grandmother with a fluid identity. I don't conform to the pronoun discourse or some of the stuff that you might see on the Reservation Dogs episode, whatever I said earlier, that there is a way to find space, but to recognize in any space, like within our way of bringing people in and together, to ask ourselves, are we doing this just to check the box, or are we actually working at being inclusive and being closer to? And this connects to the idea of what ceremony is. So I would say, if you haven't sought the knowledge of local ceremonialists or knowledge keepers, that's important, even just to welcome a space in a way that might not necessarily be recognized, but that idea that we have to, I guess, fit in the ceremony, to my understanding, and this is, in broad senses, no matter what type of ceremony that we're engaging in, it's a bringing together, a closeness, an acknowledgement that we want to connect in a specific way. And so there are things that we can create in contemporary times, and there are traditional, connected to land, people, history, bloodline teachings that also can come into play. And it, again, depends on your stance, your perspective, your culture is where you stand. But yeah, Emma, you rock, and I love the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, and all that it's done for our peoples, for my daughters and my now granddaughters, right, and grandsons, right? It's bringing that perspective, and I think being welcoming and open and willing to change our our thoughts is important. Atoskawnow.
Lovely thing to say. What a lovely, lovely, lovely thing to say. I'm not great at segues today, but I'm going to tell you, imagine a really good one right there. So, so I want to thank both of our wonderful speakers today for having such, deep and compelling and rich information and stories for us today. Thank you so much for participating in today's COP. If there's some chatter in the chat, so enjoy, please keep doing that. If you're interested, folks who are in the crowd, if you're interested in participating in more intimate COPs than this, if you can even imagine that, our next COP, Carly, please correct me if I'm wrong. That is my alarm to go pick up my kids from school. But our next COP's topic will be knowing your rights when dealing with the police. And then another one, which I can't remember, but I'm sure someone will tell me eventually. But, as I said earlier, we're going to be leaving the chat open a little bit longer at the end of today if anyone wants to connect afterwards. But before we do that, again, once again, I want to thank our wonderful speakers. Denise, Emma, you've given us an afternoon full of so much brain food. It'll fill our lives and hearts with light for time memorial. So thank you so much for sharing your stories. Thank you, of course, all of you wonderful human beings for being such a wonderful group of human beings and participating today. And of course, thank you to Carly for coordinating yet another absolutely intergalactic and stellar COP. That's it for all of us here at St. John Ambulance. Thank you all again. We will see you in the next one. Oh wait, there's a thought exchange we're supposed to do too. Forgot about that. I should have said that at the beginning, but I forgot. I'm sick.
That's okay. You're allowed to be sick. So what we do have is our thought exchange. So if you've been to our COPs before, you know how it goes. We gather a bunch of anonymous data from you folks so that we can make our COPs better and keep making them more geared towards community and make sure that everybody's getting their needs met and what they want. So I've dropped a link in the chat. I also have it up on our screen here. If you want to use your phone, you can just scan the QR code. Dump your thoughts. It's a little bit of demographic information, and then also what you guys want to get next time so that we can do it better and keep making you happy. So if you want to do that, we would really appreciate it. But I want to thank Emma and Denise so much for coming and presenting. That was illuminating and beautiful, and I had goosebumps so many times throughout both of you talking. So I just wanted to thank you again, and thanks to everybody who's part of our community for coming and engaging and being with us. So thank you.